On the morning of January 23, 2018, 15-year-old Gabriel Parker entered Marshall County High School with his stepfather's 9mm semi-automatic Ruger handgun and opened fire on hundreds of students gathered within the common area of his school. This resulted in the murder of two 15-year-old students as well as an additional 18 injuries. Hello, my name is Melissa Stevening, and based on my research today, I'd hopefully like to convince you the importance of implementing gun control throughout the United States of America. According to an analysis done by the Washington Post, since 1999, the 145 acts of gun violence have taken place in the primary and secondary school levels, and the shooters behind these acts have been under the ages of 18. Discussions and conversations about implementing trainings for school teachers, should another shooting occur, banning military-style firearms, conducting further background checks, improving mental health awareness and treatments, and even arming teachers have been occurring for years. However, it all does boil down to one common denominator. If gun control was heavily implemented as politicians continue to say it will be someday, these brutal, traumatizing mass murders could ultimately be prevented, and we could still have the lives of those we love today. As reported by multiple surveys conducted by Harvard and Northwestern University, approximately 40% of Americans say they or someone in their household owns a gun, and 22% of individuals, which rounds out to about 72 million people, report owning a gun. Personally, this baffles me. It's mind-blowing. The power behind a weapon of that caliber, especially a semi-automatic, has one thing in mind, and that is to ultimately inflict harm. As someone who can honestly barely kill a fly, I will probably never understand or begin to understand the fascination with these firearms, much less the need to own them or purchase them. In addition to these alarming statistics thus far, it has been reported that although the U.S. does only have 4%, which is a pretty small chunk of the world's population, it does subsequently own about 40% of civilian-owned guns globally, according to a 2018 report from a Switzerland-based small arms survey. Hypothetically speaking, if, say, these percentages continue to rise as gun owners become encouraged to purchase firearms and use them by any means necessary, as politicians encourage, we could be looking at a very continuous rise in gun violence that could unfortunately exceed beyond the capability of even being controlled. As a former high school student, in a time where school shootings were at a pretty steady rise, unfortunately, some of my most vivid memories of my high school experience surround gun violence. Unfortunately, our youth, much like me, you, and so many others younger than us, have an increasingly disturbing access to these guns, oftentimes finding them in a parent's belongings, much like Gabriel Parker did when he pulled his stepfather's gun off the top shelf of their closet in the suburban home that they lived in. It's bad enough that the children of our society have to deal with bullying or worrying about their lunch money being stolen, but when it comes to a shooting in a building that was once supposed to be a safe haven for education, it does become every student and their parents' nightmares. Those loud bangs of the doors closing in the hallways could easily send someone under a table now rather than it did back in maybe 2005. For example, I believe when I was in 5th grade, the infamous tragedy that is the Sandy Hook Massacre took place in Newton, Connecticut, in an elementary school much like my own at the time. It was the same kind of campus, roughly. Personally, I don't have too many vivid memories of the details of the shooting itself. However, I do remember the letter our school had sent home that our teachers were like, oh, you have to take this home and your parents have to read it. And you have to read it, and everyone has to sign it, and you can bring it back. Or it was something along the lines of if you bring it back, you get extra credit. I remember that the most, and the worrisome look upon my parents' face when I got home from school that day. And I'm gonna be honest, from that point on, it seemed almost as though that gun violence and school shootings would remain this prevalent looming figure, kind of like that creepy curtain back there, throughout the basis of my educational career as I grew up to be kind of this college student I am now. I think the hard thing about growing up in this century is that we've always dealt with some type of drama going up. Not drama, I'm sorry, I misspoke, trauma We were born in the age of 9/11, and now we battle school shootings and the possibility of that happening nearly every day. Fast forward a couple of years, I found myself in my high school's English department on February 14th, 2018, when the initial news of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shooting first boomed across social media platforms and the news channels alike. That was terrifying. As the school year progressed, we did have a few instances where students, mainly freshmen and sophomores, would bring guns onto campus inside of their backpack. And I think it was typically with the hope of causing trouble. But we also had the threat of shootings and bombings taking place in our longer passing period between periods 3 and 4, because that was I think it was this time called terrier time or nutrition break or something like that, but it was something that happened pretty often. These kind of only solidified the need in at least my mind, and I'm sure so many others around my age, that gun control needed to happen now. I think that with us growing up in trauma as much as we have, this mindset is shared pretty globally in the teens closest to my age. I'm 18, so anyone younger and probably around the age of 15 can understand, because they've grown up in this kind of time period too. Unfortunately, sorry, this is a hard topic, but unfortunately it seems as though the many gun owners throughout America see owning a firearm and having that much lethal power under their belt as a way to boost their social standing. In addition to this mindset, roughly 49% of gun owners say that all or most of their friends own a gun, whereas only 1 in 10 of those who do not own guns say that all or most of their friends own a gun. In addition to these percentages, and somewhat of a stark contrast like many others, surveys do continue to prove that, in a sense, a majority of gun owners are under the impression that they are safer with a gun in their home, rather in the reach of their children, rather than the latter, which would not be owning one at all. As gun right activists continue to be backed by the long-standing narrative from the National Rifle Association, who continues to argue that a good guy with a gun can save people from gun violence, it was actually proven in a 2015 study by Harvard University that people defended themselves with a gun less than 1% of the 14,000 crimes from 2007 to 2011, which somewhat proves the lack of a need for firearms if you really want to look at it. As we are now in a year of some of the most socially and economically interesting times of at least my lifetime and probably yours, it's pretty disturbing to revisit the idea and acknowledge the fact that gun sales have spiked throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and coming up to the 2020 presidential election. In fact, according to the widely cited Small Arm Analytics and Forecasting Committee and consulting firm, total firearm sales in August of 2020, just before the election, actually exceeded sales for the entirety of 2019. As I've mentioned previously, if we continue to kind of just ignore this hike of percentages in our nation, whether it be purchasing or shootings, this gun control factor is going to spin out of control and we won't be able to get a handle on it. The time to act is now. Much like we did with Black Lives Matter and everything we could to protest police brutality, you can do this with reaching out to your political officials and demanding gun control in your state with a simple email or phone call to their office. To close today's speech, I'd like to remind you that we have gone over some of the statistics regarding the amount of guns owned throughout the United States, the amount of school shootings done by those under the age of 18, and the importance of getting a handle on gun control now rather than later. Unfortunately, I am a little bit sick, so I kind of might seem out of whack. But I hope that this speech was informative and beneficial and that you continue to remain safe and healthy throughout these changing times. And I wish you and your family the best of holidays.